Not all kids in America are safer at home. With schools closed, experts are worried that child abuse is now going unreported. NBC News Now correspondent Alexa Liautaud checks in with the director of the National Children's Advocacy Center.
It really is a pandemic within a pandemic that we're facing here in America. A lot of states have talked about safe at home or safer at home types of situations. And that's great for a lot of families, but unfortunately for some children, being safe at home is a dream, not a reality. And in this situation, we have children that are in homes where they're experiencing abuse, and they don't have any mechanism to be able to tell what's happening.
What drops are you seeing in child abuse reporting?
If you compare January and February of 2019 to January and February of this year, they were right on par. Right. And so we had these trends that were very similar, very consistent reporting. And then when it comes to March and it comes to April, you see this dramatic drop, especially when you look at April, that's where we see these declines of anywhere from 40 to 70% during that month of April. In April, what was happening? Kids were not in school. Kids were at home. They were not able to leave. And that's why we believe this significant decline. So what we're seeing around the country is declines anywhere from 40 to 70% in reporting. And what we're seeing in our own community has been right at exactly a 50% decline in the number of reports to Child Protective Services and to law enforcement during this time. It's not that abuse isn't happening. It's just that kids don't have the ability to tell because the majority of disclosures of abuse are actually reported by educational authorities.
How difficult is it when children are not going to school every day in person?
When the medical crisis that we're under is over, we're still going to have a public health issue. We're going to see this dramatic surge and spike of reporting when children do return to school. And it's going to, quite frankly, overwhelm the system. It's going to be very challenging to suddenly see this backlog of cases all come in. We know this from our experience, too, because every year when we return from summer vacation, after the first couple of weeks when kids are kind of acclimating, we see a spike in reports of things that children are now reporting that they hadn't told before. We see it after the holidays during winter also. And we're not alone. Countries all over the world are experiencing these similar declines in reporting. And it's pretty uniform and universal.
And how does unemployment or further strain on the family impact this type of thing?
There are some people that are just cruel, and we know that happens, but physical abuse is sometimes exacerbated when people are frustrated, when they, their life is not going well. And if you're unemployed and you can't put food on the table and you feel guilty and you feel terrible and your kids are getting on your nerves and you lose your cool and do something, that we're seeing that dynamic. So definitely stressors increase the likelihood of abuse.
If you suspect child abuse, call the National Child Abuse Hotline. That's 1-800-4A-CHILD.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.